In fact, we are celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of our first loan to China. A distinctive character of the organization is that we work in the most poor and remote areas. We work in this area with the most vulnerable part of the population.
Not just the rural revitalization phase, which is absolutely critical, but also in terms of South-South. And I see the leadership of IFAD so critical to that. Hello, my name is Siddharth Chatterjee, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in China, and welcome to Delivering as One, a UN in China conversation. In this podcast, we highlight the heads of UN agencies in China who shape our diversity, discover their motivations, find out their work here on the ground. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Matteo Marchisio, the IFAD representative to China and Mongolia. Mr. Marchisio, an Italian national, joined the United Nations in China in 2014. Matteo, a warm welcome to Delivering as One.
Thank you very much, Sid.
So, Matteo, let's jump straight in. Early life. Tell us something about your early life, your education, growing up, your studies, early career.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, Sid, very much grateful for this opportunity to have a conversation with you and share some of my passion and vision, reasons why I'm here in China working on development. I'm an Italian who was born and grown in Milan, have two sisters. My mom was a vet, my father white collar. I mean, if I compare my own childhood, my own early life with those of my children, it was quite ordinary. I had my first trip in a plane at the age of 10. That was my 10th year birthday, from Milan to Rome by plane. And I had my first travel overseas at the age of 18. I went to Kenya. So completely different from the life of my children. But if I have to think to a distinctive aspect of my childhood, I've always been interested, attracted by diversity, cultural diversity. And this was something that interests me, and I really felt the value of that. Perhaps because my grandmother, I don't know if you know it, was Chinese, so there is some diversity in my blood as well. And this is probably the reason why I've always felt, attracted by the idea of learning from others. Thinking a bit on what brought me to a career on development cooperation, I think there were two distinctive moments in my life. One was when I traveled to Kenya at the age of 18. That was my first trip outside Europe, and that was the first time I actually experienced the poverty. Of course, I had seen documentaries, TV, but that was the first time I felt on my skin what poverty meant. And I really recall I felt a sense of injustice, unease and justice, and desire of, helping, contributing to address that issue. The second defining moment was during my times at university. And I attended a lecture, a seminar by at the time, Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, Gian Domenico Picco. And I recall that in that moment, I really found, the United Nations is exactly where I want to be. That's exactly what I want to be. And since then, all my efforts have been to try to enter into United Nations and contribute to sustainable development and poverty reduction.
So tell me, before the UN, what were you doing?
My career in the UN has been not straightforward as for others. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity for an internship in an agency of the United Nations, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, just after graduation. And it was an inspiring experience. I was there in the Geneva headquarters. I really felt working for the UN meant. But I also recall that at the end of that internship, my supervisor told me, listen, Matteo, you're doing well. If you want, we can, hire you with a consultancy contract for a few months. No problem with that. But this is your first experience. If you want my advice, don't start with the United Nations. There is so much outside the UN. Try something else. And he pushed me to apply for the private sector. So immediately after the experience in UNCTAD, I enter in the private sector, Citibank, in the internal audit unit. And 3 months after, I realized that that was definitely not what I wanted to do. But then I have the problem of how to get back to development cooperation, which was something I was feeling I was passionate about. And it was not easy. It took some time. I worked for some time at my university in Milan, until when I had the opportunity to go with Italian cooperation in Colombia on a post-recovery program after the earthquake in Colombia. And that was my entry point in development cooperation. After that, I applied and was selected as JPO, Junior Professional Officer Program, funded by the Italian government, and went with UNDP in Ethiopia. 2 years and a half there, and a vacancy opened for a position that was fit for me. But at the time, I had a girlfriend who followed me in Ethiopia, who couldn't find a job and was not keen to stay in Ethiopia. He found a job in Brussels, and I felt I had to follow her. That was my turn to follow her. So I quit UNDP, I quit the UN, I moved to Brussels. A few months later, I broke up with my girlfriend, so I didn't have a girlfriend anymore, I didn't have a job anymore, and I was a bit stuck. It was a bad period. I started reapplying. I recall I sent, without joking, at least 100 curriculum vitae, got, I would say, 80, 90 regrets. Many agencies didn't even bother to reply. Finally got 3 interviews, got 2 offers, except one, and I was in the US with the World Bank. Spent 5 years with the World Bank working on Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Senegal, until when UNDP contacted me again and offered me a position in India, in New Delhi. So I moved to New Delhi. After a couple of years, I applied to IFAD, the agency where I'm currently in, and I started my career in IFAD. First as a country manager for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, and then since 2014 as country manager for China. First in Rome, and then from 2018 as country director here in China. So in short, that's how I ended up in China.
Fantastic. Fascinating. First of all, your track record. I mean, what a diverse track record. And at a personal level, a Chinese grandmother. That's really fascinating. Who would have thought looking at you, Matteo? And how perhaps the brilliance comes from this combination of the West and the East, the mystic combination of the two. Really fascinating. Okay, so you're here in China, and your organization is here to support the people of China with the country's priorities and the UN family is large. What is your trajectory? Where do you see the positioning of IFAD, the positioning of the UN in the context of where China is today?
Let me start with IFAD, my organization, the International Fund of Agriculture Development, which is a very special agency. It's not because it's mine, because it's a specialized agency in the United Nations, but it's also the only agency of the United Nations which is an international financing institution. We basically provide loans to developing countries. Our mandate is very noble, very compelling. We aim at reducing rural poverty, enhancing food security, and overall promote rural development in developing countries. And why is that important? It's important because 3/4 of the poorest and the most hungry people in the world live in rural areas. The poverty incidence in rural areas is at least 3 times higher than in urban settings. So if we don't invest in rural areas, we are not able to address the issue of poverty reduction and hunger, food security, which are basically sustainable development goals in one. So I feel the mandate of my agency extremely compelling. We have been working in China over the past 40 years. In fact, we are celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of our first loan to China. We're the first IFAD, the first international financing institution who provide a loan to China, even before the World Bank.
Wow.
And over the past 4 decades, we have basically accompanied China in its effort to reduce poverty. We provided financial resources and technical assistance to China to develop rural areas and reduce poverty through infrastructure development, enhancement of agricultural productivity, financial inclusion, supporting farmers to access market and increase their income. That's what we did. We work in the most poor and remote areas of the country. That's our distinctive character as an organization. We work really in the poorest, most remote areas. And over 40 years, we have reached out and benefited about 20 million of people, out of which half of them were women. So quite an impact. Now that China has achieved poverty eradication, the next challenge is to develop rural areas further, develop them economically, develop them from an environmental point of view. And that's a bit the concept, the vision of revitalization in China. And I think that our agency is really well positioned to support China in the next phase, the revitalization phase.
And perhaps because of the lens that IFAD also puts on smallholder farmers in particular, is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And that is where poverty eradication really happens. And I think China's example is quite fascinating. I feel very proud that the UN has been a part of the journey, the entire UN system with China in this effort. And what has happened in the last 42 years of lifting over 750 million people out of poverty is pretty remarkable. Even going beyond not just the rural revitalization phase, which is absolutely critical, but also in terms of South-South. And I see the leadership of IFAD so critical to that.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't mention, but that you're precisely correct. China, through this its development process, has generated so much lessons, knowledge that is worth sharing with the rest of the world. And we need to take advantage of our presence here in China to facilitate this cooperation, knowledge, technical cooperation. Just to give you an example from our programs, IFAD introduced in some provinces biogas digesters, which was a quite innovative technologies here in China. It had a great success, and because of that, IFAD in Africa started introducing the same technology. That's a clear example of how an innovation introduced in China that demonstrated to be successful was later on scaled up not only in China, but in other continents, in Africa precisely.
I've seen it. But tell me, when was these biodigesters introduced in
It was early 2000, in the first decade
no wonder,
of 2000.
because I've seen it in many parts of Africa, these biodigesters. I didn't know. I didn't make that connection. Fantastic. That's fascinating. Okay, so now that, China has moved forward, it's got this big focus on rural revitalization. Could you provide some insights, the beneficiaries of your organization, particularly from a perspective of leaving no one behind?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned earlier that a distinctive character of the organization is that we work in the most poor and remote areas. Not only we work in the most poor and remote areas, we work in this area with the most vulnerable part of the population. You mentioned smallholder farmers that have less than 1 hectare of land. So they basically survive with subsistence agriculture. Women, ethnic minorities, youth, and most recently we start engaging more and more with disabled people. These people are the most vulnerable and they are the target of our project. When we start a project, the idea is really to support them and enhance their capacity and opportunities so that they move out of poverty. We consider to a certain extent, the organization that work on the last miles, one that really try to leave no one behind. So that's a bit whom we work with in China as well as in the rest of the world.
So what would you say, Matteo, would be the remaining development challenges that China is confronted with, that we could collectively be supporting China to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, the achievement of the 14th Five-Year Plan? What would you specifically think of will be the remaining challenges that China faces that we could be working on, not only as the UN system to support IFAD, but IFAD supporting the rest of the UN system?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned earlier that China was able to bring 750 million out of poverty in 4 decades. That's something unique in the world history. It's a remarkable achievement. However, the development challenges are not over. I basically see 3 remaining challenges and 3 priorities for China in the years after 2020. The first one is that although China was able to bring all the population above the poverty line, there is still a significant part of the population that live above but close this poverty line. And this part of the population is vulnerable, can easily fall back into poverty in presence of a sudden shock, unexpected event, which can be a disease, the loss of employment, some unexpected expenditures. Many people fall into poverty because they're supporting their children to go to school. So during those years, a bad harvest because of adverse weather conditions, or a drop in the commodity price for farmers. And this was really, highlighted by the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic showed that although everyone is potentially vulnerable to the disease, those that suffer most impact are the vulnerable, because they have less means, less capacity to cope with the long-term effects of the pandemic. So the first priority for China is to take care of this vulnerable part of the population. Cannot be any more defined as poor population, but is vulnerable. And so extending social protection to this part of the population, enhance their resilience. These are things that China would need to deal with and take care in the next few years. The second challenge is inequality. Although several progress, there is still inequality between the coastal regions and the central and western provinces. Within the same province, within the same region, between better off and worse off areas, and in general between urban areas and rural areas. Salaries in urban settings are 3 times higher than in rural areas. People migrate from rural areas to urban areas. Most of the active population in rural areas migrate to urban areas for 6 months or more during the year, leaving basically their children, the young children, and the elderly or disabled people behind. So if you, and probably you have gone to a rural village in a poor areas in China, you would basically encounter only children and their grandparents. And this is, in my view, socially not sustainable in the long run. Mm-hmm. So China needs to invest in rural areas, needs to develop rural areas so that it can retain or attract back all the active population, the young generation that move to urban areas. So that's the second challenge and the second priority. The third and last that comes to my mind is environmental sustainability. Progress in economic terms that China had over the past 40 years are remarkable, but they came at the cost of environmental degradation, pollution, contamination of soil, water resources, air. So for the future, as we move on, China needs to take care of its own environment, need to think more in terms of introducing the concept of environmental sustainability in their development models. And they're already doing that. The concept of green development embrace very much this concept. In China, but also outside. So contributing to the global reduction of carbon emission is an area where China has a role to play. And looking at the latest statements of President Xi Jinping, it's something that they're taking care of.
Interesting. Let me summarize. So 3 key points. Number 1 is building up resilience. Number 2 is reducing the inequalities. And number 3 is to safeguard the planet, the climate and the biodiversity. And that's where I see a clear linkage, not only with President Xi's announcement of China really advancing to carbon peaking by 2030, but what's interesting is the Kunming conference, where our colleague, the head of UNDP, Beate Trunkman, said that what Kunming is to biodiversity, Paris is to the climate. And, I think China's responsibility in moving this agenda is commendable. So I think safeguarding that biodiversity is going to be absolutely crucial. And I'm glad that, we are in this together, particularly with our cooperation framework also with China. Well, thank you for that. In fact, you've also put some ideas into my own head, Matteo, for my subsequent discussions for the future. A day in your life, what's it like from morning to evening?
Okay, well, have to say that no one day is the same as the other one, except for Sundays, which are fully dedicated to my children, so I bring them to play football. Any other day is different from the previous one. The activities I do can be meet and discuss with the government on our strategy, how IFAD can support China, the China government, in meeting its development objectives, in fulfilling its priorities through our instruments. It can go on going to the field to design our operations or supervise or provide implementation support to the implementing agencies, or to meet and discuss with the beneficiaries to understand and learn from what we're doing, reaching out our counterparts or partners, academia, international organizations, private sector, to discuss how we can collaborate together and have a joint impact through our work, or advocating sustainable development by participating in conferences or workshops. And lastly, but not last, I spend a lot of time in my office supporting my team. In the end, is the one who delivers on what we do. So supporting them, providing coaching, providing resources, advices. This is pretty much encompass what I do in my days as country director for IFAD in China.
Fantastic. How many children do you have, Matteo?
2, 8 and 10 years old.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So how are they in soccer?
Well, as they have some Italian blood,
it's natural.
It's natural.
It's natural. Bravo. Great. So tell me, Matteo, what does delivering as one mean to you?
Okay, well, delivering as one, let me go back perhaps to the image that I somehow shared at the very beginning when I was in Geneva headquarters just after graduation during my internship. I recall of that experience living on a daily basis the UN headquarters in Geneva. Several agencies there, people from all around the world working together on a common shared vision. This to me is really delivering one. Development is so complex, the causes behind poverty are so complex that no agency can think to do it by itself. And by joining our capacities, our different mandates, our respective niche, we can hope to achieve something greater. So delivering as one is really becoming more efficient, but also more effective in what we're doing. Always having in mind a common goal, which is basically the Sustainable Development Goals.
Fantastic. So, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, our overall boss, came into his role with the particular perspective of transforming and reforming the UN. And that's where he put the repositioning of the UN development system and has really, brought in the whole, delinked the resident coordinator role from UNDP and made that much more independent with an oversight responsibility. What, in your view, makes a good resident coordinator of the UN system?
Well, that's a $1 million question. I have to say that, I sympathize, but in a positive way, on the resident coordination position. It's, in my view, an extremely difficult role because you basically have to lead, coordinate 20, 25, 28 agencies, as in case of China, all of which have different agendas, different incentives, different priorities. And you have to do it without having a formal authority on many of them and with very limited resources. So it's, to me, an extremely difficult task, but necessary. I mean, going back to your previous questions, unless we are starting to develop as one, our effectiveness and our relevance in the development world would slowly decrease. So what would be an ideal resident coordinator? A resident coordinator is basically a leader. There is no ideal leader. There is no ideal resident coordinator. To me, a leader has to somehow adjust its leadership style depending on the circumstances. So sometimes he has to lead, sometimes he has to support. Sometimes he has to push, sometimes he has to pull. Sometimes he has to speak first, sometimes he has to speak last. It has to basically adjust his style on the circumstances, on the need. Certainly one thing that he has to do is helping, supporting the country team in developing a shared vision. That's very important. That's probably the role that a coordinator has. Pulling everyone and try to develop together with them a common vision so that everyone walk towards that vision. You don't have an easy job, Sid, but I think it's challenging and fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that was great. And any other thoughts in general, as we are now we've started the cooperation framework with China 1 year down the line. We've seen there's a hub of activity which is taking place in terms of the transport conference, the climate agenda is front and center, FOCAC is happening around the corner. Any thoughts about how you see that we could better reposition the development system of the UN to be able to be sensitive and responsive to China.
Very good question. One thing that I learned, as I said, I started working on China in 2014. So this is my 8th year working on China. And one thing that really impressed me is the fast pace by which China developed and changed. To me, last year, 2020, was to a certain extent a pivotal year. End of poverty. So basically, China has declared that poverty is over. So the big challenge for us as UN is to define what role we have to play in China over the next decades, because I definitely see us remaining engaged in China for the next decades. It's certainly not a short-term vision. The key point is that what we used to do even 5 years ago cannot be replicated in the future. China would probably need less and less the UN for supporting its domestic agenda. What strategic role the UN can play in China are, first, and you mentioned at the very beginning, helping sharing the knowledge, the lessons, the experience that was generated through the development process of China elsewhere. South-South cooperation is a buzzword, but that's precisely what we can do. Secondly, helping China to play a more active and leading role to deal with global development problems, climate change, biodiversity, peace and security. So what I see is really the UN and China working together and collaborating less and less on the domestic agenda and more on the global agenda.
Fantastic, Matteo. Thank you very much for sharing your story, sharing your time with us today. If you would like to learn more, visit china.un.org or follow the UN in China on our Twitter handle. Join us next time for another installment of Delivering as One, a UN in China conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.